Let us pray. Our Father, we confidently ask for your strength and encouragement in our service of you through our service of others. We humbly ask for your gift of wisdom to guide us in making good laws and good decisions for the present and the future of Alberta. Amen.
Introduction of visitors. Presenting petitions. Reading and receiving petitions. Presenting reports by standing and special committees. Notices of motions. Introduction of bills.
Mr. Speaker, I request leave to introduce Bill number 14, the Small Business Term Assistance Fund Act. This is a money bill, Mr. Speaker, and Her Honor, the Honourable Lieutenant Governor, having been informed of the contents of this bill, recommends the same to the Assembly. Mr. Speaker, the Small Business Term Assistance Fund is extremely important to the province of Alberta in terms of our economic policy for this spring session, and essentially parallels a similar bill, the Farm Credit Stability Fund Act, which was introduced just a few days ago. Speaker, this legislation confirms our campaign commitment to establish a $750 million fixed-rate, 9% interest rate program for the small business sector of this province. This fund, or this act, provides for the establishment of the fund and provides for the legislative authority to make regulations under the act, which will set out the terms and criteria of the loans themselves. Through this legislation, Mr. Speaker, we will find that in Alberta, in the small business sector in particular, we will generate new jobs, new investments, and a new vitality will come to the small business sector of this province.
The Honourable Provincial Treasurer has moved first reading of Bill number 14, Small Business Term Assistance Fund Act. Does the Assembly agree to the motion for first reading? Opposed? So ordered.
A bill being Small Business Term Assistance Fund Act, introduced by Honourable Mr. Johnston, is now read a first time.
Mr. Speaker, I request leave to introduce Bill number 9, the Department of Economic Development and Trade Act. This being a money bill, Her Honor, the Honourable Lieutenant Governor, having been informed of the contents of this bill, recommends the same to the Assembly. Mr. Speaker, the purpose of this act is principally to reflect the changes that in organization that occurred in January as a result of the restructuring of the Department of Economic Development and Trade from the former Department of Economic Development.
The Honourable Minister of Economic Development and Trade has moved first reading of Bill number 9, Department of Economic Development and Trade Act. Does the Assembly agree to the motion for first reading? Opposed, if any? Carried.
A bill being Department of Economic Development and Trade Act, introduced by Honourable Mr. Shaven, is now read a first time.
Mr. Speaker, I request leave to introduce Bill number 4, the Department of Forestry, Lands and Wildlife Act. This being a money bill, Her Honor, the Lieutenant Governor, having been informed of its contents, recommends same to the Assembly. Mr. Speaker, this bill formally establishes the Department of Forestry, Lands and Wildlife.
The Honourable Minister of Forestry, Lands and Wildlife has moved first reading of Bill number 4, Department of Forestry, Lands and Wildlife Act. Does the Assembly agree to the motion for first reading? Opposed? Carried.
A bill being Department of Forestry, Lands and Wildlife Act, introduced by Honourable Mr. Sparrow, is now read a first time. Tabling returns and reports.
Mr. Speaker, I wish to file with the Assembly the report of Mr. Al Dubinsky on the Disputes Inquiry Board into the dispute between the United Food and Commercial Workers Local 280P, Edmonton, Alberta, and Gainers Incorporated of Edmonton, Alberta.
Mr. Speaker, I wish to table the 68th annual report of the Workers' Compensation Board of Alberta for the year ended December 31, 1985.
Mr. Speaker, I wish to file a response to question 137.
Mr. Speaker, I wish to table the report of the Chief Electoral Officer on the general election of the 21st Legislative Assembly held Thursday, May 8, 1986, and to note that there will be a supplement when the information is available, expected in mid-August 1986, on the financial addendum for the election.
Introduction of special guests.
Mr. Speaker, it is my pleasure today to introduce a couple of very special guests from Bow Valley constituency. Mr. and Mrs. Don Alberts are seated in the members gallery. Don is the chairman of the directors of the Eastern Irrigation District. He's also a feedlot operator and a very progressive farmer. Mrs. Alberts was for several years the principal of the school in my hometown. They're seated in the members gallery, and I would now like them to stand and receive the warm welcome of the Assembly.
Mr. Speaker, in your gallery today, I would like to introduce to you and to members of the Assembly Mr. Patrick Ledgerwood, Chief Electoral Officer for the province of Alberta. He is accompanied by Mr. Brian Feildheim, Director of Election Operations. Would these two officials please stand and receive the warm applause of the Assembly?
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to introduce the Reverend Joseph Curcio and Mr. Hank Zip. Father Curcio has been a parish priest in various third world countries throughout most of his life, but also for 2 years he was a parish priest in the Boyle Street area of Edmonton, in which he founded Our Place drop-in center for addicts and prostitutes and others. Mr. Speaker, he is currently and has been for 2 years a parish priest in a parish in Nicaragua, to which he will be returning shortly. In that parish, Mr. Hank Zip helps run a Change for Children farm cooperative, assisted with, amongst other sums, a $12,000 grant from the government of this province. It's a development project in the Muella de los Bueyes area in Nicaragua. If the gentleman in the public gallery will rise and receive the welcome of this Assembly.
Mr. Speaker, it is indeed a pleasure today to introduce special guests visiting our city from Wetaskiwin and Leduc constituency, Richard and Violet Martin. Their daughter married Stockwell Day, and who is in the legislature, and along with them is Ray and Barb Schmaltz, and they're all into Edmonton because of the big Gideon Convention. I wish they would rise and accept the warm welcome of the House.
Mr. Speaker, I would like to introduce to you and through you a lady who is currently running as a candidate in the Calgary Municipal Election Ward 13, which is in my constituency, Calgary Glenmore, and the Calgary Shaw constituency. And I'd like you, Mrs. Flo Balcrow, to rise and receive the warm welcome from this Assembly.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to introduce to you and through you to the members of this House a constituent of mine keenly interested in the political process, coming from the fine constituency of Red Deer North, and within that fine constituency, the even finer area of Oriole Park. And I would like Valerie Ward to rise and receive the warm welcome of this Assembly.
Mr. Speaker, it's my pleasure to introduce to you and through you to the members of this Assembly, Mr. and Mrs. George Jansen of the hamlet of La Creek, 25 miles south of Fort Vermilion, the second oldest community in the province of Alberta. And the Jansens have been very active in the community, both with the Chamber of Commerce and with the committee attempting to put in place an ambulatory care facility in the community of La Creek. I would ask them to stand and receive the warm welcome of this Assembly.
Ministerial statements. Oral question period.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to direct the first question to the Premier, and it refers to the Treasurer talking about the private sector, and we'd like to talk about what is really happening. Dun & Bradstreet has done an alarming survey of Alberta business failures, which indicate that in the first 6 months of this year, there's been a 46% increase in numbers of business failures over the same period last year. My question to the Premier, has the Premier asked his cabinet colleagues, perhaps coordinated by the Minister of Economic Development, to go back to square one at this particular time and thoroughly review provincial economic policies? And if he hasn't, I'd like to know from the Premier what he's going to do to stop this tide of red ink.
Mr. Speaker, certainly nobody is pleased when there are bankruptcies, and if there was just one, we would be concerned. And obviously there are more than that. I might draw the attention, though, to the Honourable Leader of the Opposition that there are some conflicts in statistics. I have a summary which shows that there are 10% less this year over last year. And, Mr. Speaker, I don't think the honourable member should just take any report that arrives and consider that it is the gospel. And perhaps we should try and see how the statistics differ so markedly, and then perhaps we could discuss it.
Supplementary question. I'm glad the Premier asked, because we did check it out. He's going by bankruptcies, but Dun and Bradstreet are talking about business failures, which includes receiverships, proposals to creditors, receiving orders, and bankruptcies. That's the difference in the figures. But the major point that I want to make to the Premier and come back is recognizing that we're having these problems. Is there now a new economic strategy that is being developed by this government to compensate for these major problems that we're having?
Yes, there is, Mr. Speaker.
Supplementary question. The Premier may be cute and say, yes, there is. I think the people of Alberta would like to know. But let me ask one other question to the Premier. The Premier indicated that the previous government's vaunted white paper, he hadn't bothered to read it. I take it now that he's gotten around to read it, saying that the Treasurer was one of the authors. Is this still the direction that this government intends to move towards?
Mr. Speaker, again, the Leader of the Opposition is incorrect with the allegations leading up to his question. I certainly read a great deal of the white paper. I just didn't read every word of it, which is what I said to somebody, and they have since passed it on, I gather, to the Leader of the Opposition. Mr. Speaker, the white paper had a great deal of valuable information, and as a result of it, members of the government were able to garner a tremendous amount of input from Albertans all over Alberta. And certainly the valuable portions of that will continue to be used in future government planning. I might say, Mr. Speaker, if the Leader of the Opposition is looking for new directions, he only has to look at the throne speech and the budget.
Well, glad the Premier's now a speed reader, and his idea of new is slightly different than mine, because I think we've had election campaign on those particular things. My question is to the Minister of Economic Development, and it has to do with some other piece of bad news. Spot world oil prices are now falling below $10 US a barrel. My question is to the Minister of Economic Development. Is the Minister doing any ongoing studies correlating oil prices and business bankruptcies? And if so, can he give us some idea what an oil price of less than $10 will do for our business economy?
Mr. Speaker, I'm not sure whether the Honourable Leader of the Opposition was in the Assembly the other evening when we began to deal with the estimates of the Department of Economic Development and Trade. But in it, I outlined the priorities of the Department of Economic Development, particularly, Mr. Speaker, with respect to small business, international trade, and diversification. I also made the comment, Mr. Speaker, that oil and natural gas and agriculture, all of us recognize as the key ingredients of our economy. And having those two main elements of our economy being battered at the same time cannot but affect the overall economy of the province. Our response, Mr. Speaker, has been I believe, as the Premier indicated, outlined in the throne speech and the budget speech very effectively. And today, the provincial treasurer introduced a piece of legislation that provides for a $750 million fund to support small business. Now, if the Honourable Leader of the Opposition would also refer to April 9th Hansard, when my predecessor outlined the initiatives that had been taken by this government in diversification and broadening our economic base, I would think that his question would have been answered both there and earlier by the Premier.
Supplementary member for Westlock Sturgeon.
Supplementary, Mr. Speaker, to the Premier, who may want to pass it on to the provincial treasurer, in view of the fact that Sheikh Yamani is now selling oil for less than $8 a barrel. What does he forecast his new deficit will be?
Mr. Speaker, that is something I would imagine the Honourable Provincial Treasurer might want to respond to. However, I would think, Mr. Speaker, that the gentleman opposite shouldn't take such pleasure in sad news. They seem to just glory in the fact that there are problems. Now, everybody recognizes problems, but I can hardly see them restrain themselves when they see that there are problems for the energy industry with low energy prices. We have, Mr. Speaker, a great deal more confidence in this province than they do, obviously. We feel that the people of Alberta can handle the problems, and the people of Alberta will handle the problems despite the negative thinking of the members of the opposition.
Member for Little Bow.
Mr. Speaker, supplementary question to the Premier, and it's a question of confirmation from the Premier. The Leader of the Official Opposition has indicated that 46% of business failures in the province of Alberta through various means. So I wonder if the Premier could confirm or reject the policy of government as to whether it accepts the proposal of the New Democratic Party that feels that the solution to saving those businesses is pumping in public funds in order to maintain them in the province of Alberta.
Mr. Speaker, I think on that matter, the Honourable Leader of the Representative Party and myself have very similar views.
Second main question, Leader of the Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, the Minister obviously has had a chance to review the Dubinsky report, although, of course, we in Assembly have not yet. But will the Minister tell us which of Mr. Dubinsky's recommendations he will be implementing first?
It's not a matter of me implementing the recommendations, Mr. Speaker. I have already sent copies of the report this morning to Mr. Pocklington, representing Gainers, with a copy to Mr. Ponting, his legal counsel, and have also sent a copy to Mr. Ventura, the president of the local of the union here in Edmonton, with again a copy to Mr. Dara, the representative from Toronto. We will now wait for the responses of the two parties to the report from Mr. Dubinsky.
Well, supplementary question, Mr. Speaker. Now that the report has been given, the minister really has no more excuses. So my question to the minister, will he be announcing a mechanism for a speedy review of our, if I might say so, terrible labor laws next week at the latest? And if not, will he tell us now what he's waiting for?
Mr. Speaker, I'm not going to take the opportunity to get into a debate about the quality of our labour legislation in this province, although the leader gave me ample opportunity. That review will occur. It will be announced shortly, and it will be done with reasonable speed in order to review the legislation to see if there are problems with it and what can be done to correct it. The nature of the review will be announced in due course.
Well, that's what we like, shortly or due course. That could mean in the 20th century sometime. My question, though, to follow up, Mr. Speaker, Mr. McMillan of Fletcher's has emphasized the importance of national parity at Gainers for the whole meatpacking industry in the province. My question to the minister, given the Dubinsky report, has the minister seen any evidence that anything other than parity and a change to our laws will lead to a Gainer settlement?
Mr. Speaker, perhaps I should quote from some other information from Mr. McMillan, which is included in Mr. Dubinsky's report. Because neither firm goes along with Canada Packers' trend-setting agreement, contends Fletcher's president Gary McMillan, the eastern-based unions now want to shut down what's left of the hog industry in Alberta. He contends that AFCWU members are ignorant on the larger issues and do not realise that they could close the plants for good with unrealistic wage demands. They don't have a clue. Their jobs are on the line, but their unions played a fairly large game with their jobs, and I'm afraid they're not going to like the consequences. Mr. Speaker, I quoted that to indicate that apparently Mr. McMillan has made several statements in relation to this dispute, also in relation to the Gainers dispute specifically. It's not up to me to judge the calibre of those statements. I presume that other people will do that.
Well, supplementary question. It wasn't the major point, but I'll come back. I just got a piece of paper. Apparently, Mr. Dubinsky does not recommend parity, and his starting rate for new employees is only a bit above the $7 rate, which they could see it in 1984. My question, given that report, does the minister see any evidence at all that this will lead to a resolution of this dispute?
Mr. Speaker, I hope that the two sides will look at the 25 recommendations that are included in the report and that they will study the recommendations carefully. I would hope that it will reach a settlement. The the specific that was mentioned by the Honourable Leader in his question, the figure quoted by Mr. Dubinsky is exactly halfway between the $7 that was existing in the previous agreement as a starting wage for new employees and the $9.38 requested by the union.
Supplementary, member for Edmonton Gold Bar.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. To the Minister of Labour, Mr. Dubinsky, however, does recommend serious consideration be given to examining the Labour Act, particularly in the area of replacement employees. Would it be the Minister's intent to consider bringing in amendments to the Act in this regard, which clearly is, in Mr. Dubinsky's mind, a serious problem, while the further study of the whole Labour Act review is taking place?
Mr. Speaker, I would regard Mr. Dubinsky's last paragraph in the whole report, which is the one mentioned by the Honourable Member for Gold Bar, as a recommendation to me that we give consideration to examining the specific provisions of the Labour Act. That will certainly be a part of the review of labour legislation that I was just talking about. He also says there are several possibilities, and he didn't pick any particular one. He obviously left it to the review to take place and to make that decision.
Supplementary question to the Minister. Could the Minister indicate whether, at this point in time, any timeline has been established in terms of acceptance or rejection of the report by the two parties? And I'll leave the question there.
Well, there are provisions within Section 102 of the Labour Act. Acceptance has to be given to the Industrial Relations Board within 10 days, or the board carry out a vote of the employer or the employees. So there's a 10-day interim during which they have the chance to respond to the Labour Relations Board.
Supplementary question, member for Calgary-McCall.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Could the Minister of Labour respond that considering that the NDP and others like that would like to shut down the Gaynors plant and lose jobs to Eastern Canada, is it not the objective of the government to see to a peaceful settlement and keep Albertans working in a plant operating in Alberta?
I'm sorry, Mr. Speaker, I didn't hear the centre part of the question.
Honourable member refrain from debate, but ask the question, please.
Mr. Speaker, the middle part of the question, as our thin-skinned friends have heard, is it not the objective of the government to see to a peaceful settlement and keep Albertans working and a plant operating in Alberta?
Mr. Speaker, I have said repeatedly that the main aim of all the fairly intensive efforts of this government and the department, and I have listed those before in the Assembly, so I won't repeat the information, but all of those efforts have been aimed at achieving a settlement, preferably by the normal collective bargaining process. That continues to be our aim, and I think was also the aim of Mr. Dubinsky.
I'm sorry, honourable member. Points of order will be raised at the end of question period, but I will recognize you then. Main question, Leader of the Liberal Party.
Mr. Speaker, to the Premier, I might first remind the Premier the only joy that $8 oil brings is to his national leader in Ottawa, not to anybody in this House. But in view of the Premier's singular lack of success in getting the Husky upgrader built, getting the PGRT removed, establishing a proper price after cancelling the NEP's floor price of $22.50, and lastly, standing idly by while the National Tories give a $1 billion grant to the East Coast energy industry, when will the Premier start putting pressure, real pressure, on the federal government?
Mr. Speaker, that certainly is being done in a variety of ways every day. It is a matter that we're concerned about, and we are concerned about the problems facing our energy industry. We get no enjoyment out of it, nor do we try to play political games with those facts. But, Mr. Speaker, we are working to help in every way possible the energy industry through a very difficult time.
For Westlock,
Supplementary. When will Albertans begin to see some long-term proposals from this government now that Sheikh Yamani has put the price of oil down below $10?
Mr. Speaker, we have assisted the energy industry, as the Honourable Leader might know, very dramatically starting last year, a dramatic decrease on a long-term basis in royalties. Very dramatic decrease in royalties, which supplied hundreds of millions of additional dollars to the energy industry. That decrease goes on years and years and years into the future, a long-term assistance. Also, we reduced the royalty tax credit by $100 million, and that continues long into the future. We've also come up with additional assistance this year for the remainder of this year in order to give time to work with industry to come up with additional projects that may be able to help them on a longer-term basis. It's important that we know that the long-term assistance is devised in a way that will have the needed results. And we are working with industry and with the federal government to come up with that kind of a scheme.
Second supplementary, Mr. Speaker. Royalties are still higher than they are in the 1970s. What assurance does the Premier have that the federal government will support last week's Minister of Energy statement that aid to small producers could take the form of an equity package?
Mr. Speaker, as the Minister of Energy mentioned, that was one option that's being looked at because it was raised by a certain portion of industry. And therefore, since the industry has raised it, we think it should be given serious consideration. There are other ways to look at it, Mr. Speaker, and there are a variety of proposals coming from industry. They're all being evaluated, and we will try and see if we can't come up with one that really does the job. I should point out, Mr. Speaker, that the province can only do so much. This is a national industry, and it's important that we are able to come up with a scheme that will involve support from all parts of Canada to help the energy industry. It's so important in the future.
When will Albertans, to the Premier, Mr. Speaker, I'll have an easy one. When will Albertans see some sort of leadership from this government? As starters, when can we expect Ottawa to remove the PGRT?
Mr. Speaker, nobody in this House has any better idea, I suppose, about that one, except the federal government. We have been asking them to remove the PGRT. We've made very serious representations to them. They are giving it very serious consideration. The Alberta members of Parliament are fulfilling their responsibility and also pushing very hard to have the PGRT removed. I think, Mr. Speaker, that it is the least that can be done on behalf of the federal government, considering the tremendous contribution that Albertans made to the rest of Canada during the period of high energy crisis. Some small amount of money that's involved, relatively speaking, in the PGRT, I think should rapidly be removed, and then some additional assistance, which, regardless probably of how large that would be, wouldn't come close to the contribution to Canada that Albertans have made over the past 5 to 10 years.
Member for Edmonton Norwood.
Mr. Speaker, now that the spot world oil prices are below $10, I would like to ask the Premier at what price it will take this government to ask the federal government to renegotiate the Western Accord and bring in a floor price and import quotas. Is it $9, $8, or 20 cents a barrel?
Great.
Mr. Speaker, the Honourable Leader of the Opposition has only one idea, which he keeps referring to, which is a floor price. I've told him and other members of the legislature that while it is way down on our list, because it has a great number of deficiencies in it, Mr. Speaker, there are certainly other various proposals that we're also considering, ones which we think will do the job far more effectively than the one that the Leader of the Opposition has mentioned.
Member for Little Bow.
Mr. Speaker, my question is to the Premier. It's with regards to the discussions going on with Ottawa. I understand the two ministers of energy are discussing the matter. In the interim, because of the seriousness of the matter, is the Premier speaking with the Prime Minister? And if so, if that has happened, what is the current attitude of the Prime Minister with regards to this subject? Is it only concern, or has he placed himself on record in terms of some substance with them, particularly with the question of the PGRT?
Mr. Speaker, I've discussed the matter with the Prime Minister at various occasions. However, the conversations which I have with him, I'm afraid I'm unable to disclose to the House, and therefore I can only say that the Prime Minister is aware of the desires of our government and the needs of our energy industry, and we only hope that that awareness is translated into assistance.
Supplementary, member for Calgary-Milliken.
Yes, Mr. Speaker. A previous question by the member from Westlock Sturgeon seemed to confuse me, and I think it left some confusion. He's asking about a commitment to the Husky upgrader, and I just wonder if the Premier can't clarify that for me. Did we not get a commitment for millions of dollars to start the engineering and the design work, which takes a few years? And is that not going ahead? Was there not a commitment there?
I'm glad the honourable member mentioned that, Mr. Speaker. I didn't touch on it, although it was raised by the member for Westlock Sturgeon. It is true that the Alberta government, the Saskatchewan government, and the federal government have worked with Husky in a cooperative way, and that project is proceeding. We hope, Mr. Speaker, that a final go-ahead on construction will be given and full completion after the engineering work, which was essential to do, is completed.
Main question, Leader of the Representative Party.
Mr. Speaker, my question is to the provincial treasurer, and it's with regards to the Alberta Farm Credit Stability Program. A number of farmers wishing to make some new purchases and also look at refinancing current credit are asking what they should do in the interim while the minister and the government is trying to put this program in place. I was wondering if the provincial treasurer could indicate what steps the farmer should take during this interim period of time. Should there be short-term borrowings? Should there be refinancing and negotiating with the bank that can be refinanced and renegotiated again after the 9% program and application is in place?
Mr. Speaker, I think there are several general explanations that can be given for the period between now and the time that this program, the Farm Credit Stability Program, is up and operating. The first thing I would suggest is that the farmers get their financial position in order. That is to say, the information that's necessary for them to provide to the farming or to the financial institution, some evidence as to their cash flow, and describe for their own financial institution the purposes for which this money may be required. That may well be in addition to the existing line of credit which is established by the farmer at his own bank or financial institution. But secondly, Mr. Speaker, I believe that the financial institutions are now well aware that with the introduction of this legislation, both the small business legislation today and the Farm Credit Stability Act a few days ago, that the government's commitment is clear to make this program work. The money will be available to make it effective, and we can give all the private sector, the farm and the small business sector, the assurance that the program will be up and running, and therefore this pause will allow the existing financial institutions to at least provide a recess in terms of foreclosures or putting additional pressure on the private sector. So I'm hopeful, Mr. Speaker, that by the time we get our negotiations completed with the financial institutions in the next few days, that we can move with the program, and the comfort that we have described, which will flow to the farming and private sector community, will in fact be available to them.
Mr. Speaker, supplementary to the provincial treasurer, and with regards to the source of funds, the Heritage Savings Trust Fund was mentioned as interim funding, potential funding. Secondly, the offshore or with other countries and as well banks. Could the minister indicate at this time whether those sources are in place and negotiations have been finalized?
Well, of course, Mr. Speaker, in terms of the provision of immediate resources to make the program operate, that is the funds which will be transferred to financial institutions, I can give the assurance that we do have the resources to do just that from a variety of Alberta-based resources, that is the Heritage Savings Trust Fund and whatever surpluses are available within the General Revenue Fund itself. But secondly, we are investigating the best possible set of options for us to secure long-term borrowing for these two programs, to flow into the funds and therefore provide the resources for both the Farm Credit Stability Program and the Small Business Program itself. I cannot give any specific commitments at this point or further details about the way in which this financing will take place, except to say that we're examining all of the possibilities. The rates seem to be trending in the right direction, and the currencies, which obviously set in place some of the problems in terms of swapping or the exposure which we take, are now being examined very carefully, so we can get a matrix or a combination of exposure in a variety of markets and a variety of currencies to make the programs operate.
Mr. Speaker, supplementary, in terms of the Heritage Savings Trust Fund, the funds that will be diverted into this program will they be funds that are currently earning an interest rate or a net benefit, I guess, to the Heritage Savings Trust Fund at the present time? Will those be the funds that will be diverted?
Yes, Mr. Speaker. Obviously, we have maintained in a liquid form a fairly sizable pool of assets within the Heritage Fund itself. I'm not absolutely clear as the exact amount, but it does approach $1.75 to $2 billion. And that money obviously would be available for transfer to these two funds, which have been set up by legislative authority, and then on to the financial institutions to make the program operate. And we will be using that as a first drawdown until we can put the long-term financing in place at the most advantageous rate. The rate charged by the Heritage Savings Trust Fund to these two funds, should it be operative, would be determined by the current T-bill rate or some other appropriate rate, and therefore we would pay from the General Revenue Fund and from the operations of the fund to the Heritage Fund some reasonable rate for the use of that funds over that term.
Mr. Speaker, as clarification in terms of timing, the Minister indicated that shortly or in about a week that there will be more further announcements in terms of concrete substance. Could the Minister be a little more clear with regards to that timing? Are we talking about third week of July, fourth week of July, as to more of a public pronouncement about the program?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I think some of the fundamental details with respect to the program have already been put forward by my colleague, the Minister of Agriculture, and will be made available today by my colleague, the Minister of Economic Development, in those two programs. Enough information, at least, to provide general direction to the financial community and to the farming and small business community themselves so that they can tailor their own program as to whether or not it will fit within these programs. Obviously, Mr. Speaker, it should be clear that some farmers and some small businessmen will be ineligible for the program. But in both cases, it's designed to take in as broad a possible cross-section of farmers and small businessmen as possible, and we're doing that by using our financial resources of the province, both in terms of the funding which the member has inquired about, and in terms of providing guarantees to the program, to the financial institutions, to ensure that in those difficult cases, the farm loan or the small business loan is made. In terms of the specifics of the program, in terms of dates, obviously, I've been here for at least 2 or 3 years, and I can assure you that I know that from my honourable colleague's experience at least, you don't want to get tied down too specifically to a date. I have already said that in the Farm Credit Program, we would like to have it operating by the end of July, and I fully believe we can meet that commitment. If we can do it sooner, obviously we'll. In terms of the Small Business Program, as we've indicated before, Mr. Speaker, it'll take us just a touch longer to put it in place, and probably that'll take into August sometime, because our priority right now is to deal with the particular problem raised by my colleague, that is to satisfy the farm credit sector, and we're rushing with all our resources and efforts to get that done as soon as possible.
Member for Vegreville.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Supplementary to the Honourable Provincial Treasurer, would he confirm that one of the reasons for the inordinate delays in the implementations of this program is the difficulty he's having in persuading private lending institutions into accepting 9% loans on loans for which they're receiving a rate of prime plus 1.5, prime plus 2? And that being the case, will all the refinance type loans under this program be directed through the ADC?
Au contraire. To the contrary, Mr. Speaker, I should indicate that in fact the financial institutions have been extremely responsive and supportive, and I don't anticipate any problem at all with respect to any of the banks or credit unions or the trust companies who are involved, and I have had the greatest deal of confidence that we can put a package together which will work. None of the suggestions which the member leaves in the Assembly are in fact a problem. We have only to get down to the details as to what the costs are and how the guarantees will work, and that's a question of across-the-table negotiations. The fact is the banks are extremely supportive, the credit unions are extremely supportive, and that's the kind of cooperative spirit we're working with in this province.
Member for Panoka-Rimby.
Mr. Speaker, I wish to pose a further supplementary question related to the possible source of funds for this program. Mr. Speaker, could the Provincial Treasurer advise as to the schedule of repayment of principal under the Canadian Investment Division of the Heritage Savings and Trust Fund, and whether it will be government policy to redeem those amounts in full as they come due?
The member has tested my memory just a touch, Mr. Speaker, but it is my recollection that through 86 and through 87, a significant portion of the Alberta's contribution to Confederation and the assistance of other provinces in borrowing funds will be returned to the province with very high interest rates. And I would expect that between now and the end of '87, approximately $450 to $550 million will be coming back to the Heritage Fund as those interprovincial loans come due. And of course, unfortunately, those rates were at a much higher rate than is now available in the commercial market. But I don't anticipate that the provinces in particular will use this source of money, that is the Heritage Fund, to roll the loans over. They will probably instead go to the other sources of commercial money in Canada, the United States, and offshore.
Member for West Loch Sturgeon, final supplementary on this subject.
I think this is just the official supplementary. I thought we followed, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, then the question is to the Minister, supplementary to the Minister of Agriculture, who may want to pass it on to the newly sophisticated Minister, or Treasury Minister here. Could he tell us, in point of view, the weight that appears that will have to be taking place before these things can be put into place, that he will have the Farm Credit Corporation declare a moratorium on any procedures that are moving towards foreclosures or anything while we're waiting for the new plans to come into place?
Mr. Speaker, I'm surprised that the honourable member from West Loch Sturgeon doesn't recognize that Farm Credit Corporation falls under the federal government.
Member for Calgary Glenmore, followed by the member for Edmonton Glengarry.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Through you, I'd like to ask the Energy Minister if he could please give me an update on the shared industry government programs relating to the oil service companies, and a follow-up as to the development of these programs, as well as the effect that these programs have had with the private sector.
Well, Mr. Speaker, one aspect of that program was a question was asked yesterday in terms of the take-up on the incentive programs that were announced last April and in June. The exploratory drilling program, which has a deadline of the end of the year on it, is a program where the take-up hasn't been as great as I had hoped it would be. However, having said that, we do go through a yearly cycle where most of the exploratory drilling occurs in the fall and winter, and the expectation is that we will see a larger take-up on that program in the fall. The other two programs that, two programs that are being responded to reasonably well are the developmental drilling program and the well servicing program. And I say reasonably well as best we can tell at this particular time, because the applications for those programs would not be coming in a large way until after the work is done and the contractors have been paid. So the expectation is that during the later part of the summer, those two programs that have a deadline of the end of September will be taken up. The geophysical assistance program is more tied in terms of timing with the exploratory drilling program, and we expect that there will be further take-up on that program later in the year as well.
Member for Edmonton Glengarry, followed by the member for Calgary Buffalo.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. For the Minister of Environment, yesterday in his lengthy dissertation, the Minister said a number of things which demand clarification. Estimates now see the cost of the dam, the Old Man Dam, escalating from $200 million to $349.6 million. Every other major dam this government has built ended up costing at least 2.5 times the estimated cost. What real evidence does the minister have that the final cost of the Old Man River Dam will not be over $500 million? Well,
Mr. Speaker, I don't quite know how I can look into the future. In the overview statement that I gave yesterday, with respect to the estimates of the Old Man River Dam, I talked about three components. So with respect to the dam, component number one, which would cost X amount of dollars, component number two, which would cost X amount of dollars, and I talked about land acquisition costs, environmental, archaeological, paleontological, mitigative costs. I pointed out that that in terms of land acquisition, some individuals have received upwards of $700,000 for land prices. That was more than we had originally anticipated. They eventually found their way working here for the NDP in Edmonton. I indicated as well that part of the dam infrastructure is the land associated with roads. The road to the dam is not an actual cost factor with the dam, but in some recent correspondence from folks in the Cayley area, they pointed out and indicated to us that they thought it would probably be appropriate for the government not only to build a dirt road, but perhaps pave it. Now, if the decision is made to pave it, there's no doubt at all about the fact that the price will go up.
Honourable Minister, we're in question period on an estimate. Supplementary question, please.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Is the minister doing anything at all to try to curb these alarming cost overruns, or is he content just to let the cash register for the dam keep on ringing till we have our first billion-dollar dam in this province?
The answer to the question, Mr. Speaker, is an emphatic yes.
Supplementary. Supplementary. What's on that? Glad to hear it. Supplementary, Mr. Speaker. What studies does the minister have comparing the benefits of more irrigated land in southern Alberta at a cost of over $7,000 an acre compared to developing new agricultural land in other areas of the province?
Mr. Speaker, in terms of the guidance that you gave me in response to the first question, I want to clarify my response to the second question. The member very, very specifically asked me if the minister was concerned about the cost and was he taking steps to ensure that they would not escalate, and my answer was a very emphatic yes.
Yes. My figures are based on present costs, by the way. Mr. Speaker, could the minister confirm that dams will be built regardless of cost because the government is running out of parks to name retired premiers after, and we will soon need a billion-dollar monument for the current premier?
Additional supplementaries from other parts of the House. Member for Little Bow.
Speaker, supplementary question to the minister, and this wasn't covered in his remarks yesterday and is a concern of mine. With regards to the Old Man Dam, could the minister confirm that the major purpose of that Old Man Dam is to give reliability and stability to water to the Lethbridge Northern Irrigation District during years that we have severe drought and severe problems with obtaining water for that respective district?
Mr. Speaker, yesterday in pointing out the reasons for the dam, I pointed out that water management in the southern part of the province was a primary reason for the construction of the Old Man River Dam. Honourable members will recall the various questions and debates that occurred in the House during the heavy drought years in the early 1980s through 1985, and the need to move forward with a very sophisticated project, an important project for the long-term future viability of agriculture and economic diversification in the southern part of the province.
Member for Westlock Sturgeon.
As supplementary, Mr. Speaker, to the minister, is the minister conducting any studies, or is he going to commission any studies to give him an idea when that dam will be silted up to the extent that will no longer be supplying water?
Mr. Speaker, the Old Man River Dam, as so rightfully pointed out by the member of Little Bow, is extremely important to the long-term viability of the southern part of this province in terms of agriculture and the like. If the honourable member from Westlock Sturgeon had been in the legislature yesterday afternoon, he would have noted that I spoke for some period of time with respect to the importance of the dam and the variety of studies that were being undertaken. I would like to point out, Mr. Speaker, that the blues that were printed as of yesterday cover 33 pages of text. Of those 33 pages, 16 were taken up by comments made by the Minister of the Environment in one of the most important economic diversification and agricultural projects that we have in this province, and 17 pages of that were initiated by procedural wranglings established by the Socialist NDP party.
There are 3 minutes left in the question period. The chair recognizes the member for Calgary-Buffalo.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I have a question for the Honourable Premier. Mr. Premier, in the Western Accord, the government agreed that the market should determine the price of natural gas. Yesterday, in contradiction, the Premier stated that the government will insist that Alberta gas not be sold below fair value, thereby rejecting the market. Now, will the Premier tell the House and those companies which are currently in the midst of negotiating gas contracts just what he considers to be a fair market value of natural gas and the principles that he would apply in determining that fair value?
Mr. Speaker, natural gas is an extremely important resource to the people of Alberta. They own it. And obviously, Mr. Speaker, if the market is operated between a buyer and seller in a fair and reasonable way, then they will end up with fair market value. We're not rejecting market value, but people who were here long before me or the honourable member knew that the importance of that resource should also have built into our legislation and our leases the ability to ensure that it is sold at fair market value and not wasted by being sold too cheaply. I've expressed that in the House 2 days now. I think it's something that's extremely important to the people of Alberta that be known. And I'm not sure whether the honourable member would suggest that we should not fulfill that responsibility and have the resource wasted by having it sold too cheaply. I think Albertans would say no. And I'm not sure what the honourable member is suggesting in that regard. I think the government, any government I'm part of, will insist that before we approve a gas removal permit, that we must be assured that it be sold at a fair price.
Supplementary.
Forgive me, honourable member. Would you like to take time for question period has expired. Does the Assembly agree to finish this series of questions? The questioner plus his own series of supplementaries. Honourable member, supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Supplementary to the Premier, who does not seem to realize that it was his government that set in motion the collapse of gas prices. Now, would the Premier be prepared to state whether would the Premier be prepared to state whether he would consider the cost of competing fuels in the sales market to be the primary test it would use for establishing fair value in its own mind?
Well, that would be certainly one of the tests, Mr. Speaker.
Supplementary. Thanks for the idea. Mr. Speaker, is then the Premier aware that the government is currently circulating proposed amendments to the Provincial Arbitration Act, which would have the effect of reducing the price we receive for gas by moving away from this competing fuels test? Is the Premier aware of that?
Yes, I am, Mr. Speaker, and that would be another test.
In light of the government's concern over the receiving fair value for its gas, would the Premier undertake to maintain the current provisions of the Arbitration Act in order to prevent the disastrous collapse of our natural gas prices?
Mr. Speaker, I don't believe there will be a disastrous collapse of natural gas prices. They will move with the market, and we will continue to exercise our responsibility to make sure that they are not sold excessively cheaply, because that is a waste of the resource. And I would perhaps in debate the honourable member could tell me whether he would encourage us to not fulfill that responsibility. I'd be interested to know his position. While I'm on my feet, Mr. Speaker, I want to respond to the member from Edmonton-Glengarry, who I think does not do himself a service by taking cheap shots at a former premier of this province. And if he, in his period of time in this House, is able to contribute even a little bit of the amount that the former premier contributed, he'll be doing himself a big credit.
The chair recognizes the member for Edmonton Norwood on a point of order, since we've come to the end of question period.
Mr. Speaker, we're told that we can't make points of order officially, but we cannot do the sort of thing that the Premier did just now in question period, and I would suggest that perhaps the Premier try to learn the rules of the House too, instead of trying to be cute. Mr. Lougheed can look after himself. Mr. Lougheed can look after himself, and a lot of people were concerned about the name of that park, Mr. Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I have every right to supplement a question that has been presented. If the honourable members are so thin-skinned that they can't take an answer, then they shouldn't ask the question. When you take cheap shots, you better duck.
The chair recognizes the legitimate concern of the Leader of the Opposition when he raised the matter with respect to the Premier's comment, but it did occur after question period had come to an end. If we have... Thank you, honourable members. If you would like to continue to tell me my job, perhaps we could take consultation in that chamber. Is that the member for Edmonton Centre? We have another point of order to deal with. Chair recognizes the member for Edmonton Highlands.
Mr. Speaker, in light of what's just gone on, I think I'd like to refer back to some comments made by the member for Calgary-McCall. And I do recognize that a little sparring goes on in this place. However, when it comes to making allegations about, well, I'll quote the standing orders, making allegations against another member or imputing false or unavowed motives to another member, in this case collectively under the provisions of Standing Order 23, I think that we have to note that we take objection to the motives being imputed to us collectively with respect to support for anybody in a gainer's dispute. We do not, I think, want at all to see the closure of a plant, and it was that allegation that I believe was made. Similarly, we do not at any time ever want to incite violence under any circumstances, and I just called the attention of the Speaker to that point of order.
The chair recognizes the point of order, and at that time, during question period, the chair also rose and called the member for Calgary-McCall to order on that point. The chair has had a request from a minister to supplement information as requested in the previous question period. Do we have unanimous consent of the House for that to take place? The Minister, thank you. I apologize. The Minister of Community and Occupational Health.
Mr. Speaker.
All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Opposed, if any, please say no. Orders of the day.